This General Assembly kicked off with a focus on climate change, as British Prime Minister Boris Johnson pushed world leaders to pledge big cuts to greenhouse gas emissions ahead of the COP26 climate summit in November. But the big announcements began the next day, at the high-level debate, when Green campaigners welcomed a surprise from China's President Xi Jinping.
China will step up support for other developing countries in developing green and low-carbon energy and will not build new coal-fired power projects abroad.
Joe Biden's maiden speech to the UN as president marked a return to a belief in multilateralism for the US.
We're back at the table in international forums, especially the United Nations.
It was a reassuring, if not electrifying, speech for the General Assembly.
It didn't do anything new, but it certainly was a continuation of a rhetorical 180-degree turn from the Trump years, in which that administration never met an ally they liked or thought that international cooperation was a term that would be uttered in public discourse.
Despite the focus on multilateralism, the podium was also a pulpit for publicising regional disputes. Pakistan accused India of a purge on Muslims, to which India's delegation used their right to reply from the floor.
This is not the first time the leader of Pakistan has misused platforms provided by the UN to propagate false and malicious propaganda against my country.
Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas threatened to rescind recognition for Israel, an ultimatum that was ignored by Israel's new Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, who instead called for an end to Iran's nuclear program. Meanwhile, the new Iranian president, Abraham Raisi, took aim at US sanctions, which he described as organised crimes against humanity. The biggest news, though, perhaps, was made by those who didn't speak. Both the UN ambassadors for Myanmar and Afghanistan withdrew from the event, having been appointed by governments no longer in charge of their respective countries. Nevertheless, the disintegrating situation in Afghanistan was in sharp focus at the General Assembly, with a nearby protest and repeated demands for a more moderate Taliban government from member states and campaigners.
We cannot make compromises on the protection of women's rights and on the protection of human dignity.
$400 billion of new investment to increase access to electricity and renewable power was pledged at the UN's first high-level dialogue on energy held in more than 40 years. And at a COVID-19 summit convened virtually by the White House, the US pledged an additional 500 million doses of COVID-19 vaccines for developing countries. Speaking of jabs, a mobile vaccination centre was set up by the City of New York beside the UN. But the General Assembly did not enforce a vaccine mandate for delegates, allowing an address from unvaccinated Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro hours before his accompanying Minister of Health tested positive for COVID-19. The UN says it's seen no sign of any further cases linked to the event. But even though the US asked member states to send video messages because of the threat of the pandemic, more than 100 representatives gave their speeches in person. Analysts say it shows the importance still placed on the gathering.
There were the usual bilateral meetings that can only be done in person to person. Zoom simply does not replace one-on-one, off-the-record conversations.
And while politicians made headlines, it was pop singers BTS that stole the limelight with their speech on youth engagement and a performance at the UN headquarters watched live by over 1 million people, capturing the attention of a new generation in a way no world leader ever could. Sarah Walton, CGTN, New York.